Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brothers and sisters, welcome back to the After Maghrib podcast. We are now in the silence after the storm of Ashura. In the days after the battle of Karbala, we reflect as to what we have seen. Because Karbala was not the end, brothers and sisters, it was the beginning. The beginning to growth that comes from grief. Sorrow that leads to strength, ways in which we can reflect, ponder, apply not just the goodness that we saw in Karbala, but also the godliness as well, inshallah. And that's something we've been discussing over the last few weeks if you've been tuning into the podcast. As always, brothers and sisters, if it's your first time here, please make sure to like, comment, share, subscribe, and also, inshallah, stay to the end of the episode because we hope this will be beneficial. We're going to kind of get into 2 or 3 key conversations in this episode. But before we introduce our beloved, highly requested guest, inshallah, gives me great honor and pride to be alongside my dear brother Sayyid Ali Radhawi. Assalamu alaikum Sayyidina.
Alaikum assalam, Habib Ahmed.
How you doing, bro?
Alhamdulillah, wa ajurak.
Minna minkum, Habib.
It's been, for me this year, phenomenal. The nights of Muharram, you know, I've managed to attend a number of communities, sat down in the presence of amazing scholars and speakers through all over London. Yeah, mashallah, just I think within northwest London there was about 10 majalis going on. So we had ample of choices, and I've met so much amazing brothers this year who have had some deep conversations with me, and I know we've had some as well together, Ahmed, where we say, you know what do we want to achieve this Muharram? How is Imam Hussain going to improve our spirituality, our obedience to Allah, things like this? So it's a continuous journey.
Of course.
And inshallah, we bring this continuous journey for our spiritual growth onto the podcast.
Inshallah.
And inshallah, we do our best to.
Inshallah. And before we go any further, brothers and sisters, as always, we offer condolences to you. This is our first episode after the day of Ashura. And more importantly, to the Imam of our time, Sahib al-Asr wal-Zaman. As of course these are still the days of mourning, so inshallah we'll try our best to reflect and do justice to this epic, this historic tragedy, which is still as important, still as contemporary as it should be. Now, to introduce our guest, brothers and sisters, this is someone we've had, as I mentioned, hundreds of requests over the last few years.
Indeed.
Alhamdulillah, we're very honoured and blessed to be joined by our dear Sheikh Azhar Nasser. Assalamu alaikum, Sheikhna.
Alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you so much for having me.
Allah ajurakum, Sheikhna.
Allah ajurakum.
It's an honor to be here with you. Thank you so much, of course, for spending your time with us. How do you feel each year, if you don't mind me asking, after the day of Ashura, when you look back and reflect on the first 10 days of Muharram and how the communities come together, the transformational movement that we're all on, how does it make you feel as someone who is considered one of our community leaders and someone who's had the experience, the exposure to so many global communities? When you see the movement of people, the change of hearts, how does that make you feel?
You know, alhamdulillah, I have the privilege of traveling around the world, and I meet communities from North America, from the UK, from all over. And I see the month of Muharram as a manifestation of the power of 12 Shi'ism, of Tashayyuh. You know, Imam Hussain alayhi salam has the unique ability to draw in people from all walks of life. You know, it's almost like throughout the year we go through these ups and downs in our spirituality, and no matter how far someone drifts away, and you might be talking about someone who hasn't prayed in a year, who's the furthest away from religion, who's just hanging on by a thread. But there's something about Imam Hussain alayhi salam that just pulls them in. So I look at the majalis of Imam Hussain alayhi salam as a spiritual hospital.
Yeah.
That no matter where you are, no matter how wounded you are emotionally, spiritually, there's a place for you in this majlis. And all of us, we need that spiritual healing from Imam Hussain alayhi salam. You know, that's why sometimes when I talk to parents who kind of worry about their kids, community members who are, you know, who feel like, you know, some of the youth are drifting away, I never lose hope in anybody. As long as we have the majlis of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, there is a lifeline for every single person. You know, and that's what it means to be Safinatun Najat. You know, when Imam Hussain is described as the ship of salvation, that's exactly what it is. Imam Hussain alayhi salam, he's that person who makes you feel like I can change.
Yeah.
Like I don't need to continue down this dark road. That, you know, he is, you know, he's the lantern of guidance, right? He's the ship of salvation. No matter how tumultuous, you know, the waves of fitna are in your life,
Yeah.
there's a ship.
Yeah.
There's a ship there that you can cling on to. So it's, you know, for me, every year just seeing new faces, people who reconnect with their faith, it's remarkable. And I think it's a testament to the sincerity of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, that, you know, when you do things purely for Allah, Allah just amplifies the impact of your actions, right?
Hassan, very beautiful. It reminded you, you spoke about spirituality. You know, subhanAllah, just a few nights ago, Shaykhna had a conversation with a friend, a very deep conversation where he told me he feels like there's a distance between him and establishing salah recently over the last few months because he was going through difficulties. And coming to the majalis, he said to himself, you know, I tell myself I am Hussaini. How can I not go and pray?
Yeah.
And he was having these thoughts with himself. And you're right, you know, these majalis, they bring us back. They steer us back towards that you know, that spirituality that we need to attain, inshallah. And alhamdulillah, I've been blessed, I would say, by increasing my spirituality over many years. These are thanks to people like yourselves from the manabir and the pulpits. And I had the opportunity and the pleasure to attend a number of nights, your majalis this Muharram.
Yeah.
And I want to mention something, Shaykhna. You mentioned something, I think it was night 2 or night 3, about the children and suffering and Gaza, and you were linking everything. And I remember we spoke in your Masa'ib, we spoke about the daughter of Imam Hussain. After your majlis, I went to another majlis. And that time, when I was in that majlis, I had my daughter with me, Shaykhna. And I felt like when I was having tears, when I was reacting emotionally to the Masa'ib from the Shaykh in the majlis, my daughter was like holding on to me, looking at me, speaking with me. And I just remembered your lecture.
Yeah.
I went back, I was like, yeah, subhanAllah, like the tragedy of Karbala is so great that our daughters and our sons, they deserve to know who Hussein is.
Absolutely.
They deserve to know what's the reason behind all our tears, what's the reason we go majalis, why we beat our chest, why we hold azar, why we make mawaqiz, why we walk in our millions to Karbala. And I think we owe it to them. And I think a conversation like we're going to have today is going to change, inshallah, the future generation.
Inshallah.
So that if I could just add something.
Yeah.
Because we as Shias, we grew up with majalis, we really take majalis for granted.
We do.
What do I mean by that? If you think of people who don't have any connection to faith, their entire world revolves around materialism. Mm-hmm. They don't really have inspirational figures in their lives.
Yeah.
Like think about your average individual, your average non-Muslim, especially the men among them. Have they ever listened to an hour-long lecture about how to be a better human being and actually cry? Yeah. Like think about most people, especially men, and I'm focusing on men because I think it's very, very important for men to be attuned with their emotions. I think actually that's a sign of masculinity, that there's something very cathartic about sitting and listening to a story about a struggle against falsehood, a struggle against injustice, and shedding tears. I think it humanizes us. Yeah. You know, when I listen to the tragedy of Imam Hussain, it's really the only place in the world where as a man you can bawl your eyes out and not be embarrassed. It's the only place where you can actually cry and actually feel proud that I cried. Because these tears, we need these tears. We need these tears because these tears keep our hearts from becoming like stone. Yeah. So I actually think human beings need to cry more. There's a lot to cry about. But I'm not talking about tears of despair. I'm talking about tears that empower you. That you listen to the story of Imam Hussain and you think like wow, someone like him actually existed. Like it gives you hope that there's a reason why God created all of us, right? There is a plan. And what an honor to have a place like a majlis to bring your kids. People are desperate to instill ethics in their kids. And we get to bring our children, and they get the best lessons on what it means to be a true human being. And they get the emotional connection. I mean, I feel like I've become a better father just by attending the majlis of Imam Hussain. Because you start to compare yourself to Hussein the father. As a brother, right? Imam Hussain alayhi salam, he had sisters. When I listen to Imam Hussain, I start asking like, look at how beautifully he treats his sisters. I want to be Hussein the brother of Zainab. Hussein the husband. We live in a world today where you have guys who want to get married and want to do the whole 50-50. Imam Hussain didn't say to Rabab, 50% of the finances are on me, 50% on you. He was the wali of the women folk. Like that's rujula, that's masculinity. That's what it means to be a man.
Yeah.
So we get a minimum of 10 days of that. Do you understand like how revolutionary that is?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Sheikh, there's so many ways. Subhanallah, the blessing of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam is that when you start talking about one thing, one quality of him, something else comes to mind. And it's like a ripple effect, and before you know it, you have a million avenues to go down in terms of his fada'il and of course his masa'ib as well. But one thing you mentioned in terms of the hedonism of society, the egoism, the materialism of the world we live in, this capitalistic world where people are so engulfed in their own selves, the desire to work on themselves. And we hear a lot about humanitarianism, of course, in the world around us, but something new in terms of an ideology we've been seeing a lot in recent years, especially in the last decade or two, is humanism. The idea that people focus on themselves, the growth of themselves, the comfort of themselves, the convenience for themselves. Yep. In Japan, you have towns where you have hundreds of thousands of people who the government facilitates them to live by themselves. They work at home, their food is delivered to home, they live by themselves, they don't engage in marriage or anything like that. And it's to serve that egoistic nature of themselves. And something which I feel the world needs now more than ever is a moral standard. A standard which we can look up to, a standard which tells us that what is the difference between innate human goodness and evil.
The barometer.
The barometer, right? And we know, of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us numerous times in the Holy Quran about the fitrah and about the innate primordial nature of man and women, of course, and the way in which, inshallah, we can work towards goodness. Now, a question I have for you, Sheikhna, especially now, I feel reflecting growing up in London, which I would argue, I don't know about you, Sheikh, but I feel London is the hub of Western Shiism. And I don't know if that's a contentious point or not. But at least what we've seen across the Western world is, in the last 20 years, there's been a globalization of tashayyu, and specifically because of the English language. So we are now able to have resources. A couple of weeks ago, we had the brothers on from Hussain and many other organizations. Many of our masajid are producing resources to share the message of Abu Abdullah alayhi salam to the wider world. How do we do this in a way which is effective, condensed, and also universal, to the point where when we speak to our peers, our colleagues, they say, Ahmed, you were wearing black for the last 10 days. Why? You're still wearing black. Why? Ahmed, you've booked a ticket to Iraq in the midst of a regional war. Why? What is it that we can share with people? How do we approach this conversation? Is there a USP? Do we treat it like a sales approach, or do we take it from a theological point? Do you see what I mean? How would you do that if someone was to come to you?
So the approach that I would take, and of course, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless all of the organizations that are doing their best to introduce Imam Hussain to the world. And I don't mean to disparage any of them. I consider them better than myself. They've probably done much more work in that regard than I have. But over the years, with age, you gain experience. You start to figure out what works and what doesn't. I actually don't think the right question or the right approach is to say to non-Muslims, okay, let me tell you about Hussein. I think a better question is, why don't you already know about Hussein? Why don't you know about a person who was martyred almost 14 centuries ago, who every year during the Arba'een commemoration, he attracts 20 to 30 million people from around the world. There are people who walk from their villages for weeks. These are not people who are wealthy. These are people who are living in abject poverty. But there's something about this man that draws them. Women, children. And by the way, what we witnessed during Arba'een, you know, if you tell any country, by the way, next week, 30 million people are going to descend upon one of your major cities, the government would crash.
Yeah.
No, they can't. I mean, how many people attended Hajj this year? 1.5 million?
Yeah.
Less than 2, yeah.
2, yeah.
And when you go there, you have to pay like 15 grand, especially if you're coming from US or Canada.
Yeah.
You can go to Karbala with no money. You can literally walk from Basra to Karbala for 2 weeks and you will be fed every step of the way. That's inexplicable. So my question is, this is happening every year in Karbala. Why doesn't the legacy media cover this? So a better question is, why don't you know about Hussein? And why doesn't CNN, Fox News, BBC, these media outlets that tell me about the most frivolous things, you know, so as I mentioned, you know, I was sitting in my home and I was watching national Canadian news, right? I don't recommend it, but there was a story, a segment about an old lady who had lost her cat. And the cat had climbed into a tree. And, you know, she was, you know, distressed by the absence of her pet cat. She calls the fire department and they come and they rescue 10 to 15 minutes about rescuing a cat from a tree in some random city in Canada. If you have time to cover that, what is it about Hussein that you don't want the world to know?
Do you think they're scared to share something, Sheikh? Or?
You know, I'll tell you this. I think all of us can agree, especially after the past 2 years, what we've seen in Gaza is that all of these governments and these institutions, it's all a sham.
Yeah.
That these governments that speak about human rights and, you know, we think that these are impressive civilizations, they're corrupt to the core. It's all talk. It's all hypocrisy. There's no authenticity between what's on paper and what's actually policy. So maybe, and we know this through history, you know, why did Saddam ban Ziyaratul Arba'een? Why is it that tyrants, generation after generation, they punish people for visiting Imam Hussain? What is it about Hussein? Is it because he liberates the mind? That the story of Hussein turns slaves into liberated people? Critical thinkers who are not hedonistic? The global elitists, if you want to call them that, the reason why they're able to amass ridiculous amounts of wealth, obscene amounts of wealth, is because they need people to remain ignorant, to be slaves of their desires, and to live a life of subjugation and humiliation. Imam Hussain alayhi salam, his message will awaken the hearts. And these corrupt institutions cannot survive in a world where Hussein is in the spotlight, right? So this is by design, and I think we have to start asking this question. You know, there are a lot of inspiring people in history. You know, you have the Nelson Mandelas, you have the Martin Luther Kings, you have people that have done good work, but it's nowhere near the impact of Imam Hussain. You know, I remember when I was a little kid. This was in 1997. I'm not going to tell you guys how old I am, but you know. So in 1997, I remember when Princess Diana, when she died in a car crash. And Princess Diana was kind of seen as this kind of this philanthropist. Yeah. She was the princess who was relatable, right? So I remember when she died, I was stunned by the emotional outpour. Buckingham Palace was like buried in flowers.
Yeah.
You saw like hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people gather in the streets. She was loved, right? She was not a perfect person, but there was something about her that made people feel connected. That was 1997. 1998, what happened? The grief subsided. 1999, 2000. As the years go by, is Buckingham Palace flooded with people? Or what's the natural kind of way that this kind of plays out? Is that with the passing of time, the grief subsides,
fades away,
and people forget.
Yeah.
Yes, you might be mentioned, they might make a documentary about you, that you might be mentioned in the pages of history. Maybe during the news, they'll be like, oh, no, this is the anniversary of, the death of Princess Diana. That's really about it. But look at Imam Hussain. It's the opposite. It defies the natural laws of grief and loss and tragedy.
Of course.
Not only does it not subside, but it grows. It's amplified. And the people who loved Princess Diana, they saw her. Maybe they met her.
We've never
met Imam Hussain.
SubhanAllah.
We've never seen him. So my question is to the non-Muslim, why don't you know about this man who's commemorated every year by millions? And what is it? It's indescribable. It's inexplicable. But the Quran actually explains it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does he say? إِنَّ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ سَيَجْعَلُ لَهُمُ الرَّحْمَنُ وُدًّا. Those who believe. And we're not talking about like belief as in like I'm a Muslim as a label. I'm talking about real belief.
Full submission.
I'm talking about perfect iman. I'm talking about the epitome of righteousness. People who are like that, and Imam Hussain is the quintessential man of faith. He is the perfection of righteousness. Allah says people who truly have faith, who are truly righteous, Allah says, I put their affection in the hearts.
SubhanAllah.
What we see with Imam Hussain alayhi salam, this is a divine hand. Even Jesus Christ, the commemoration, we don't believe that he was crucified, but those who believe he's crucified, the commemoration for Jesus is nowhere near.
Not comparable. Yeah.
The commemoration for Imam Hussain. So I would say to my non-Muslim friends, we have plenty of reason to be skeptical about the media. Let me add another reason for you to be skeptical. Why does the legacy media not cover the ziyarah of Imam al-Hussain? Why don't they talk about this? Because if it happened that 5 million people descended on Mexico City, it would make the news.
Of course, of course.
If 10 million people descended upon Paris, it would make the news. When 30 million people descend upon Karbala, that doesn't make the news. Why?
And we're talking about a city which has gone through a war, tyranny, years, of abdication and rule under oppressive regime. And of course, this is a city which is hosting and, as you said, Sheikhna, expanding year in, year out. Every year when we go, it feels like the city expands to accommodate and to host all of the Zawar. And this is something which we see year in, year out. Imam al-Husayn's message, sallallahu alayhi, is continuing to grow and manifest in our hearts, like something within us which is spiraling out of control. People spend decades of their life studying and learning and mourning and commemorating and researching everything they can about his life, his message, and still can't quite come to terms with it. What is it about this man and his message, his story, which lives within me, in my DNA, in my blood, that I would rather, and we say, We say, may my mother and my father be sacrificed for you. And these are things which you say in our ziyarat. Our ziyarat are allegiance to the Holy Imam alayhi salam. You know, the distance from his enemies, and not just as individuals, as personalities, but as an identity, as a description of immorality that we yearn to stay far from. And we make dua to keep away from anything similar to that. And of course, to align ourselves, to familiarize ourselves, and to become one and the same of the morality, the beauty that Imam Hussain adorned us with, what he showed on the 10th of Muharram and before, and of course what his family continued to show after. Say it.
I said, no, you said it very nicely, and I think you're right. He's like the magnet and that attracts. I think anyone and everyone that just knows something, even as small as one conversation he had with the enemy on the day of Ashura. It's like, how can he speak? Like, I was hearing the other day of conversations between Imam Hussain and the enemy, and he would remind them of Allah,
of course,
remind them of who he is. Although he knows, like, their swords are against him, they're sharpening their arrow and bows, like, all this is happening, yeah, he still converses, giving them an opportunity to change their hearts. Yeah, and that's the warmth of Imam Hussain.
Can I add though, Said, and
yeah.
Sheikhna, with your permission, but this time of year, especially after the day of Ashura, is when people are starting to research. I think before the Ziyarah of Arba'in.
We have the saying, the 10 days we mourn, the Azar, that's given, but then the real work starts.
The real work
Ashura,
starts, of course. Yeah. And of course the applicability starts then, and it should start from before, but we feel that the emotional high that we reach shouldn't just be left as an emotional high and a plateau, but rather it should become transformational. But I think, if you check Google Analytics, I'm sure the searches of Imam Hussein's name are higher now than they were a week or two ago, at the beginning of the holy month, and so on and so forth. So the question is now, how do we then make it a case where we counter the legacy media? For example, how do we make, obviously we don't want, maybe we can, but the discussion of Gaza and Karbala, that's a whole different conversation. But in terms of the relevance of Karbala today, people look around, they see young girls and young boys walking through flames, and they see parents who are carrying body parts of their children. They see people who are denied access to clean water. As you said, Sheikhna, people who are denying basic human rights to one another. And of course, when we see that today, we are reminded of what took place back then. Now our responsibility is to tell people that this is how we mourn, and this is what we learned, the beauty we saw in our tragedy, in our heritage. So I think it is more timely for us now than ever to actually embody what we've heard, not just to leave it at the door of the masjid and we beat our chest, we walk out and we continue with our lives, but rather think about how we can take this message to people around us. People are asking questions, Muslim and non-Muslim. So yeah,
I've thought a lot about this, because I think it requires reflection. How do you take this event? Because ultimately this was a historical event. How do you bring it out of the past and make it relative to someone who's just living in the year 2025?
Yeah.
Like, what if you were to kind of distill the message of Imam Hussain? Like, what is his message? What is his underlying message? Because I think sometimes we can get lost in the details. Like, what is the takeaway? Even if you look at the Prophet, yes, the Prophet taught many things, but what was the crux of his message? قُولُوا لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهُ تُفْلِحُوا.
Sorry.
There's something very beautiful about the simplicity of that message, that say that there is only one God. Affirm that there's only one God, and you'll be successful.
Yeah.
You'll attain happiness. Like, basically Tawheed.
Yeah.
Imam Hussain alayhi salam, for me at least, I think if you look at his statements, who better to define the movement and the mission of Imam Hussain than the Imam himself? Instead of trying to analyze, let's look at what Imam says.
Yeah.
What does Imam Hussain say? He says when he's being pressured to give allegiance to Yazid, he says, ألا وإن الدعي ابن الدعي قد ركز بين اثنتين بين السلة والذلة وهيهات من الذلة. Imam Hussain alayhi salam was given two options. One of two options. Either you fight or you live in humiliation. You see, something that people don't know and don't understand is that if Yazid said, I don't need your bay'ah, Imam Hussain alayhi salam probably wouldn't have fought. Do whatever you want, that's between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We'll do nahi anil munkar within our capacity. But the issue here is that not only is he unwilling to leave Imam al-Hussain, he's not allowing Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam to just go on his way. No, you need to endorse me.
Yeah.
You need to endorse me. So Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, endorsing Yazid, what does that mean? You give the stamp of approval to hedonism. You give a stamp of approval to godlessness, to corruption, to all of the things that strip human beings of their dignity. So Imam Hussain alayhi salam, he says there's either silla or there's dilla. Either we fight or there's humiliation.
Yeah.
And humiliation is the furthest thing away from us. So ultimately, Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam, his story is about the preservation of human dignity.
Yeah.
And I think if you ask any person, Muslim or non-Muslim, everyone wants to live a life of dignity. You know, people don't just want to live. In fact, human dignity is so important that if you take away dignity, people would rather die.
Yeah.
It's actually more important than life. You know, if you look at our brothers and sisters in Gaza, for years, they were living in an open air prison. Yes, they're alive. But is that a life of dignity? You know, when you have people in the UK, in Canada, in the US, they're working and they're struggling to put food on their table. And they're living in a system that puts them in perpetual debt.
Yeah. Shackles them.
And they have to compromise their morals to make ends meet. That's a life of dignity? That's not a life of dignity. So the message of human dignity is what resonates with people. And ultimately, Islam is a religion that upholds the dignity of human beings. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. You know, I think sometimes we have to change the way that we even look at religion. Why is this wajib? Because it preserves, or it at least preserves and increases your honor and your dignity. Why is this haram? Why is this a sin? Because it compromises your dignity.
Comes back to dignity.
So really looking at wajib and haram through the lens of what's dignified and what strips me of my karama. And that changes everything. Then religion no longer becomes this kind of limiting tradition.
Yeah.
It becomes all about God honored me, and this is how I preserve my honor. Right?
Yeah. Sheikhna, something that highly, it does frustrate us, but I think we've learned to move past it, is every single year when we mention the name of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, there is a toxicity that we see in front of our eyes. There's a putrid response that we see online from Nawasib and, you know, all of their followers, and those who come out and they throw every single accusation at the follower of Abu Abdullah and alayhi salam, and we acknowledge it, we accept it, whatever, we ignore it to a degree as well. That's one thing, we put that aside. Like, you know, say what you want about us, but to mention anything, any blemish on our Imam is a red line. Now, we live in a day and age today where we have different types of speakers across the Muslim world. Some, of course, are more aggressive in their approach, and I'm talking about the neo-Salafis, the ones who will come out, the Madkhalis, who will come out, for example, and be very vocal in their approach. They will come out and throw accusations, and they'll distort history, and they'll pick and choose riwayat and distort them and so on. And then you've obviously got other speakers who are more tactical in their approach, more strategic. They speak with a sweet silver forked tongue, for example, and they'll talk about the story of Karbala, and they'll make it a sad and a story which will appease the masses, but at the same time will slowly and slightly changed the narrative of Karbala by a couple of degrees to make everyone believe that this is what actually happened. Whether you're Sunni or Shia, we can agree with this, for example. Now, one of the things, and with your permission, Sheikh, we're going to throw a few of these misconceptions at you. Statements that people say online, specifically preachers to Muslims, and of course, unfortunately, some of our youth may fall into the trap of believing these fallacies, but how we may be able to respond to them. So when we're in school and university and the workplace, and we come across Muslims of other madhahib who throw these statements at us, how we might respond. The first of which, and I think arguably sets the precedent for all the following questions, is that the Imam alayhi salam fought a political battle, and his battle was nothing more than a fight for political leadership. I know you've addressed this in the form of tawheed and standing up for justice, and before the podcast you mentioned some very important points to me about the sulh of Imam Hussain and so on and so forth. But this is something we've seen, especially in the last 20 years, from speakers of different madhahib across the world, the English-speaking world. How do we respond to that accusation? That
the movement of Imam Hussain was purely political?
Purely political.
And he went against...
He went against the Caliph.
So the idea of some Salafi speakers is that we love Imam Hussain alayhi salam, but he was kind of misguided by some of the Shias of the time, and he started a revolution that he shouldn't have. He kind of misread the political situation. Okay, that's your argument? So why would the Prophet mourn him 50 years before Karbala? If he made a mistake, why would the Prophet cry? Why would Jibreel bring the soil of Karbala if, this was just a political thing?
Yeah.
If it was an error in judgment, why is this error in judgment so sanctified? So is your Prophet, is he honoring the error of Hussein? It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
The fact that the Prophet is crying, he's shedding tears. Jibreel, the archangel of Allah, is saying that, Ya Rasulullah, this Hussein is going to be killed in Karbala. Here is the soil. It's very obvious that this is the language of sanctity. It's not the language of a political miscalculation. I mean, you have to have a little bit of respect for your intellect.
Yeah.
That if you really believe that, you're going to face the Prophet and say that, oh Ya Rasulullah, you wept 50 years before Karbala, and you gave the soil of Karbala to Salama, and it was all just a political error. I mean, for the love of God, have some shame in front of the Prophet. So I think when you look at the ahadith where the Prophet is weeping for Imam al-Hussein, and he was the first one of this ummah to weep for Imam al-Hussein. So I think that if someone is honest, and if they put their sectarianism and their bias to the side, I think the truth is very clear. But as the Quran says, there are some people, وَجَحَدُوا بِهَا وَاسْتَيْقَنَتْهَا أَنفُسُهُم. There are some people, it's not, the truth is clear, but the hearts just don't want to submit to it.
Yeah.
That's between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But to the objective student of Islamic history, to the objective student of the ahadith, there is no doubt that the Prophet was mourning and grieving over the martyrdom of his beloved grandson who basically saved this religion.
Al-Hakim al-Naysaburi al-Mustadrak ala Sahihain, he mentions this hadith, which of course is
and it's mentioned in multiple sources. We're not talking about this kind of orphan narration, this singular narration. No,
one-off.
This is a very well documented incident.
But it's frustrating that a lot of them see the Imam alayhi salam, and we've said this before. Two brothers, 7 and 8 years old, they taught an old guy how to do wudu, khalas. They're two kids, the grandsons of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, and they leave it at that.
You want to hear something funny? You just reminded me of something. I once met a sheikh in the US. He's a revert. He was Christian. He embraced Sunni Islam, and then he became Shia. This is usually the kind of the evolution.
Yeah.
So I asked him, and this my habit is I love to hear reversion stories. So we were having a conversation, and I said that, so what made you take the leap from Sunni Islam to Shia Islam? Because, I mean, let's be honest, Sunni Islam, they have more institutions, more resources. Like, what made you take that leap? And I'll never forget his words. He said, as a Sunni, I noticed that Hassan and Hussein never grow up.
Ahmed, yeah.
They're always just the little cute
the
grandsons of the Prophet in Medina. It's as if the story just ends and no one wants to talk about what happened. But then when you look at what happened after the death of the Prophet, it's actually despicable. It's very dark. And if you look at how much the Prophet loved Hassan and Hussein, to be so indifferent about the tragedies that they faced. I mean, the Prophet, we're not just talking about an emotional love that a grandfather has for his grandsons. When the Prophet says, Al-Hasan wal-Hussein, Sayyida Shababi Ahl al-Jannah, he's not just saying that they're good people who are going to go to Jannah. They are the masters of the youth of paradise. And by the way, there are only youth in paradise.
Some say there's men.
But what does that mean? One of the ulama of Qatif, I don't want to mention names, but he said that when you say that Hassan and Hussein are the sayyids of the youth of paradise, what does that mean?
Everyone.
Not just that. What's the opposite of a sayyid? If I'm your sayyid, what does that make you?
Slave.
Follower.
Servant.
My abd.
Yeah.
Abd.
So what does that mean? That means one of the pleasures of Jannah is to be at the service of Hassan and Hussein.
Beautiful.
What does that mean?
Beautiful.
That there is a joy
Being
just being at the service of these two grandsons of the Prophet.
Yeah.
If Hussein is my Sayyid, what does that mean? I'm his abd, I'm his servant, I'm his khadim.
Subhanallah. Subhanallah.
And inshallah, we take this khidmah to the hereafter. It continues. Inshallah, I just want to talk about this matter of, Imam Hussain, Imam al-Hassan, they stayed young and everything. It's a conversation me and Ahmed reference during our conversations week in, week out, sometimes when we relate to the Sunni world, why they don't talk about the Ahl Bayt much. But is there a reason where they, I would say, fail to narrate what happened, the tragic martyrdom of Imam Hussain? Do they purposely, would you say they purposely not narrate, or they have ignorance in this?
Yeah. Sorry, because just one something to that, just as part of that question. And when we say the Shabab Ahl al-Jannah, and we mentioned this on our group chat today, ironically, does that mean that because they are the masters of the youth of paradise, the highest station, that their aqidah is fully perfected, as stated by Rasulullah, and therefore wherever they stood is where those who enter paradise should have stood? And in the same sense where Imam al-Hussain and Imam al-Hassan alayhimus salam stood in Jamal, stood in Safin, stood in Karbala, and those who stood with them on these sides, is that not an indication of what the perfected aqidah is? Sorry, just as an extension to your question.
Let's make it even more simple than that.
Yeah.
Put Imam al-Hassan and Imam Hussain on the side for a moment. Let's just kind of speak in the language of Muslims in general.
Okay.
Right? The rightly guided Khalifas. Can we agree that Ali ibn Abi Talib is a rightly guided Khalifa?
Yeah.
I think all Muslims would be like, okay, whether we're Shia or Sunni, Ali is rightly guided. When rightly guided is being fought against, doesn't it make the opposition wrongly guided?
Of course, yeah.
It's really that simple. So how can you be rightly guided and also those who fought you are rightly guided? And then Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam is Sayyid Shabab Ahl al-Jannah, and he's also being fought by people who are radiyallahu an. Yani, as we say in Iraq, what is a mahzala?
Yeah.
How much?
Yani, what kind of Jannah is this that has no standards? Yani, Jannah has no standards? That haqq and batil are that blurred? That like nothing matters anymore?
It's just a misunderstanding.
It's just a misunderstanding. Yeah. I mean,
as they say.
Whatever allows people to sleep at night.
Yeah.
I think ultimately we have to face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah.
And we're held accountable for our actions and our beliefs. And I think the truth is evident. Is the truth bitter? Yeah, the truth is bitter. You see, the problem is Sayyid Ali was asking, what is it? Is this kind of an intentional omission. Listen, I don't want to get into a conversation about intentions. Allah knows what's in people's hearts. But I'll tell you this. Karbala opens up a lot of uncomfortable questions. It's easier not to open up Pandora's box because Karbala is Pandora's box. So when you look at Karbala, okay, Umar ibn Sa'ad is appointed by who? Ibn Ziyad. Ibn Ziyad is appointed by who? Yazid. Okay, how did Yazid come into power? Muawiyah, radiyallahu an, was appointed by who? Abu Bakr. It was by Umar.
Sham.
So, if you can literally draw a line from the massacre of Imam Hussain
back to
Saqifa. So, if you think of Saqifa as, if you look at it as two trees, one tree produced a fruit or a rotten fruit, like Yazid, and another tree, which is the household of the Prophet, Shajaratun Nubuwa, it produced Hussein. I know which tree I want to belong to. I know which tree I want to take my spiritual nourishment from.
Yeah.
So it's really about asking. I mean, I think there's a reluctance to go down that path because guess what? You're not going to get good answers. You're going to be told, it's none of your business. Just focus on your salah, focus on your sadaqah.
Yeah.
It was a fitna. Allah's not going to ask you about it, right? So don't get involved, right? So and I think that this mentality is actually very, very dangerous, right? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately wants us to find the straight path, and the straight path is not this ambiguous, abstract idea. Every day in salah, ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Guide us to the straight path. What is the straight path? Sirata alladhina an'amta alayhim. The straight path is embodied by certain individuals. So I need to figure out who are alladhina an'amta alayhim. I also, because the Quran says, what does the Quran say? This is a very important ayah. This is a direct command of Allah. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu la tatawallaw qawman ghadib Allahu alayhim.
Yeah.
O you who believe, do not take as your awliya, as your guardians, those who have incurred the wrath of God. So if someone among the companions of the Prophet, if they have angered Allah, Allah says, don't make him your wali. So this brings us back to what? You bring this ayah, you place it beside the hadith about Fatima az-Zahra. Anyone who angers Fatima az-Zahra, according to the Quran, I cannot make him my wali. But unfortunately, what do Muslims do? The one who angered Fatima, angered the Prophet, angered Allah, you guys made them your leaders. And you wonder why the Muslim Ummah is in shambles?
Sheikh, can I add another misconception or another statement which we heard a lot during the days, the 10 nights, and this was coming out from some of the major speakers in the UK, Madkhali speakers, these Hyde Park corner, speakers corner debaters who we don't give much attention to, because giving oxygen to that encourages a form of dialogue which we don't believe is befitting of the akhlaq of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim wasalam, nor their followers. But one thing which we heard, Sayyid Ali will verify because you sent this video to me, Sayyid, is that the killers of Abu Abdullah were the Shia themselves. And we hear this every year in, year out, without fail. Anytime Imam Hussain is mentioned, the Shia mourn for Hussain, the Shia love Hussain. They say, yeah, but the Shia are the ones who killed the Imam. Okay. My personal opinion, if I can share, please correct me if I'm wrong, Sheikhna. Firstly, I believe the ones who abandoned and did not stand with the Imam were at fault, of course. They were silent and they choose not to stand with the Imam. Were they Shia theologically? No, I don't believe so. I believe that they may have been Shia with a small s on a political level, those who pledged a political allegiance to the Holy Imam alayhi salam, but they were not those who followed theologically the Imam in the core sense of wilaya and imama as it should have been followed. And had they been those people, then they would have been like the 72 in Karbala or however many there were. What is the response we should give? Because of course, like I said, this is something we hear year in, year out.
So you want to keep it just very simple?
Yeah.
We don't even need to go into any of these details. Imam Hussain on the day of Ashura, he's speaking to the army of Umar ibn Sa'ad. He's speaking to his enemies. What does he say? Ya Shi'at ala Abi Sufyan.
There you go. Game over.
He doesn't say, my Shia, why did you betray me? He calls the army on the other side the Shia of Al Abu Sufyan. That's it. That's it.
Case closed.
Case closed. We don't need to go into details and act like this is an argument that requires, research. Imam Hussain called them Ya Shi'at Al Abi Sufyan. That's it. Next question.
Ahsan, Sayyidina.
That's a mad one.
Yeah.
That's like puts the argument to an end. This is an individual. I shared the clip today with you. Someone who comes in and year out, any opportunity he has to say, the Shia killed Imam Hussain, and because they killed Imam Hussain, now they beat themselves as a punishment from Allah. Have you heard this one before?
Yeah, of course.
Like it's they even try to like belittle the azza that we have, the mourning that we have for the beloved grandson of Rasulullah, and they know Rasulullah said Hussain minni wa ana min Hussain. They know that Rasulullah said habba Allah man habba Hussaina. Yet on top of the misinformation that they tell their listeners and their audience and their congregation, on top of that, I want to know, why do people find it easy to mock the lovers of Imam al-Hussain as Shia when we mourn about Abdullah?
I think that there are probably some of them, if we want to give them the benefit of the doubt, who might see Shias as misguided.
Yeah.
But I would say that let's assume,
and for someone to come and say,
hypothetically, let's say that there's someone who's non-Shia that truly believes the Shias are misguided. Okay, fine. You're a Muslim, right? You believe in the Quran? أُدْعُ إِلَى سَبِيلِ رَبِّكَ بِالْحِكْمَةِ وَالْمَوْعَظَةِ الْحَسَنَةِ. Okay, if you think I'm misguided, if you think I'm someone who's lost, I'm a deviant, at least speak to me with wisdom. Have good akhlaq. Why are you mocking me? Is that how the Prophet was? So it's very interesting that in their attempt to guide us, they're actually violating a Quranic instruction, which is, if you really believe that these people are misguided, where is your akhlaq? Why is it that Allah, look at at least if you don't think we're Muslim, at least have the decency to speak to us the way that the Prophet would speak to Ahlul Kitab. So I think the problem is, sometimes you don't know whether to get angry or to laugh or to cry. A lot of these people, they're brainwashed. And sometimes, just as Brother Ahmed mentioned, sometimes you have to remind yourself of the Quranic verse. وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. Just keep on mocking. And by the way, next year, the Ziyaratul Arba'in is going to be bigger. Yeah. And you know what? Your son and your grandson is probably going to become Shia anyway. Sure. Right? It's the reality.
The game's the game.
Right?
Yeah.
But I'm not saying that to sound cocky.
Yeah. But
because all it takes, قُلْ جَاءَ الْحَقُّ وَزَهَقَ الْبَاطِلِ.
Ahsant.
The truth just has to arrive.
Ahsant.
To knock out falsehood. There doesn't even need to actually be like a fight between haqq and batil. You know how much money is spent on propaganda? It's kind of funny. Like all these resources to scare people away from the Shia, and then some Muslim randomly comes to a masjid on the day of Arafah and he listens to the dua of Imam al-Hussain, and he's like, you know what? If dua al-Imam al-Hussain Yom Arafah, it's that shirk, dude, sign me up. I'm a mushrik. What I'm trying to say is that it's pure tawheed. Like sometimes all it takes to undo all of this propaganda is just to show them. Let them read the du'as of Ahlul Bayt themselves. Yeah. So it's all background noise.
It is.
This tsunami, this Hussaini tsunami is something that cannot be blocked. That's it. It's gonna take over. And I think if you look at the political situation around the world, there is a new interest. Yeah. It's kindled an interest in people to research, like what is it about Shia Islam that creates people who are so defiant, so unwavering. It's like a noble defiance. And all of these people have one thing in common. لبيك يا أبا عبد الله, لبيك يا حسين. So my humble suggestion is, to all of your listeners, especially those who are non-Muslim, who are non-Shia, read. Don't be blind sheep. Do your own investigation. And any scholar of any madhab that says, oh, be careful, these people are misguided. No Shi'i scholar is ever going to say to you, don't read Musnad Ahmed ibn Hanbal. Don't read Bukhari. As a Shi'i student of knowledge, ask any Shia scholar. They'll say, read Bukhari, read Muslim, read Tariq al-Tabari, read whatever you want. Because that's how confident we are that we are upon the haqq. We know that the answers are all there. I'm not and we're not living in the Middle Ages where don't read this book. We're going to burn these books at the stakes. Grow up.
And you mentioned, just a final point for me before we wrap up, but the propaganda machine against us won't succeed forever. When you look at the political stakes, you mentioned, of course, the new interest in Shiism. Said and I were talking about this on a recent discussion. Senator Marco Rubio coming out and talking about the Shia and their eschatological background and who is the Mahdi and why they're working towards this messianical figure, and all of this, everything will come back. The truth will prevail. Imam al-Mahdi, Ajjallahu Ta'ala Faraj al-Sharif, will come and he will say those 5 statements at the Kaaba, of which 3 of them are about his grandfather, Abu Abdullah. And when he talks about my grandfather who died thirsty and gharib and atshan and all of these things, people will be asking, that's the same Hussein who I heard about, who my colleague told me about, which I saw on the street.
And this brings us to another important point, and maybe we'll conclude with this. The story of Imam Hussain alayhi salam is the story that is going to ignite the final revolution in this world. Why? In the beginning, what did we say? What was the underlying message of Imam Hussain?
Tawheed.
Karamatul insan, which is related to Tawheed. At the end of Dua al-Iftitah, what do we say? Allahumma inna narghabu ilayka fi dawlatin.
Karima.
The government of Imam Sahib al-Zaman is a government that upholds the karama of human beings. And the most inspiring story about the dignity of the human being is the story of Imam Hussain. Right? That's the manifesto of human dignity. So that's the connection. And that's why it's really, really important that we export and we propagate the narrative of Karbala, because that's the story. That's the story that's going to get people involved. That's the story that's going to inspire people. This is the story that creates, the axis of resistance. This is the story that is really the final hope. I mean, this is the final hope against degeneracy in the world. So I think that's where we see the connection. And I think we're blessed to listen to this story year after year. And it's, the story of Karbala is a very beautiful blend of grief and hope. We grieve what happened to Imam Hussain alayhi salam, but we also have hope that what Hussein was seeking will be achieved by Imam al-Mahdi. And if with your permission, I just want to read for you just the first couple of statements from the last dua of Imam al-Hussein. As we said, you can measure the greatness of a person by the final chapter. So what was the final chapter of Hussein? The final chapter of Imam al-Hussein was communion with Allah. But look at what he says. He says, Allahumma anta thiqati fi kulli karb. He says, oh Allah, you are my trust. You're the one who I trust in every affliction, every tragedy. Not just the tragedy of Karbala. From the beginning of my life, I always trusted you. And then what does he say? وَأَنْتَ رَجَائِي فِي كُلِّ شِدَّةٍ. And you are my hope in every severe tribulation. What hope? If you look at Imam Hussain alayhi salam, he lost everything. What do you mean hope? What hope? Imam Hussain is teaching us that no matter what happens to you in this life, don't ever lose hope in Allah. His last words were, I have so much hope in God. Imam Hussain, looking around, he rejected and condemned what was happening to his family. But at the same time, Imam Hussain was content with the system of God. And the system of God does not leave any good deed without reward. And it doesn't leave any oppression without punishment. That's Hussain. And I think that you need to live in this world with that spirit. That yes, a lot of bad things are happening, but you know what? I'm pleased with the system of God. I have hope that the scores will be settled one day, right? And the oppressors will be punished, and the good doers will be rewarded. And it reminds me of the ziyarah of Imam Hussain in the middle of Sha'ban. And maybe I think this is probably the best way to end, where we say to Imam Hussain, أشهد أنك قتلت ولم تمت. I bear witness that you were killed, but you didn't die.
Subhanallah.
بل برجائك حياتك حييت قلوب شيعتك.
Wow.
It's through your perpetual life. You look around, Imam Hussain is so alive today. It's through your perpetual life that you give us life. And I think that every time we step into the majlis of Imam Hussain, we feel like we come back to life. Because we're never going to allow the darkness and the corruption of this world to kill our hearts. As long as we have Imam Hussain alayhi salam, we have hearts that are alive. And I think the world needs more people with beating hearts, with hearts that are alive.
You've said it so beautifully, Sheikh. May Allah bless you, give you the tawfiq to continue serving the Ahlul Bayt and Imam Hussain alayhi salam. I really love how you bring those final statements that he conversed with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Remind me of also other moments during the day of Ashura, even at the very final moment when he was holding Tafl al-Radhiya in his hands, and he says, Allah, if this is what pleases you, take all you want from me, and what makes it easy for me is to know that this is under your watchful eyes. There is hisab, there is kitab, there is a day of judgment. Like even sometimes we reference Gaza, and many people ask, for example, like, how are these people getting away with murder? Like, how is Netanyahu just walking around? But there is Allah, there is a day of judgment where they will be held accountable.
And sometimes we have to always remind ourselves that this life is so short. On the day of judgment, we're all going to look back and say, لبثنا يوما أو بعض يوم. It was just a day or part of a day. وإن الآخرة لهي الحيوان. The real life is after death. The last letter that Imam Hussain wrote, the last written letter, was what he wrote to Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiyyah, his brother. The shortest letter. You know what he says? Such a beautiful, eloquent statement. Imam Hussain alayhi salam says to his brother, كأن الدنيا لم تكن. It's as if this world never was. It's fleeting. It's so short. وكأن الآخرة لم تزل. And it's as if the hereafter is all that there ever was.
SubhanAllah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I have one suggestion, by the way.
Bismillah.
Please.
What is it like almost? So instead of, I think you should change your show's name to Before Fajr instead of After Maghrib.
Yeah.
May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless you guys. And of course, may Allah bless the eyes of Sayyid Ali for his tears. May Allah bless all of you for your tears. And may Allah bless our parents for raising us with the wilaya of Ahlul Bayt. Thank you for having me.
For your time. And brothers and sisters, I'm sure it goes without saying that you would have benefited from this discussion. I'm sure as much as we have. This has been eye-opening, enlightening, and we thank the Sheikh for his time. And inshallah. Sorry?
It's been different.
From
a different lens.
I think we needed this. I think we needed this Sheikh as individuals and inshallah as a community. And we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give the Sheikh more tawfiq, to allow him to continue serving the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam throughout his life, inshallah, and to give him the strength to continue the message of Abu Abdullah al-Hussein alayhi salam far and wide across the world until his last breath. Brothers and sisters, if you are here at this point, I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to ask you if you have been benefiting from After Maghrib throughout this episode, throughout the last few episodes, or even throughout the last few years, then please consider supporting the podcast. We are a young independent group. We're trying to make a difference to the world. We're trying to unify the Shia of the Western world, and we can only do this with your support. We can continue to grow, sustain the space we're in, add new production to our work, and inshallah we ask you to consider visiting our website aftermaghrib.com, and whatever it is that you can do will be greatly rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Thank you so much for tuning in, and inshallah we will see you next week. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.